What I didn't figure out until my middle-aged years was if you can't do the 18-inch journey from the head to the heart, which is where the deep life occurs by Ecclesiastes, and almost every world religion understands that, or anybody that's been in therapy or in that space, they understand that the heart is really the captain of the ship, if you will. There's nothing wrong with the mind. We need to love Christ and God with all of our minds as well. But there's something about sinking deeper into the heart where you start to feel things and where that deep life is. That if you can't do those 18 inches, then you're forced to do 18,000 feet or 18,000 miles, like I did with the North Pole.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast. This show's available on Apple, Google, Spotify, Edify, Liftable, wherever you get your podcasts. If you like this show, would you consider taking a moment to review it on your favorite platform to help more people know about the interviews with these amazing guests? On this show, I interview major thought leaders from many fields of influence, showing how our worldview changes everything. So my guest today is Kevin DeVries, the founder and president of Grace Explorations, graceexplorations.com, a ministry that helps other ministries reach men through gospel-centered storytelling. The most recent project from Grace Explorations is called The True Summit. It's a 30-minute award-winning Everest documentary that follows 14 men and mountaineer Kevin DeVries, our guest, on a trek to Everest Base Camp. Kevin is passionate about the power of stories to motivate and inspire others and to point to the greatest story of all, of Jesus. Please welcome Kevin DeVries to the show. Kevin DeVries, welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast.
Thank you for having me on. Appreciate it.
Yeah, you're a filmmaker and you run a ministry called Grace Explorations. Your personal story is inspiring. And I'm really looking forward to talking about it, talking about the experience that you had overcoming tremendous life obstacles to actually go up to Mount Everest, to the place where people begin to summit Mount Everest,
Right.
and to make a film about all of it. And so this is going to be a cool conversation. And I'll tell you why, because here's a piece of research about Gen Z, the rising generation. Only a third of them say they like to take risks.
Mm.
That we've actually got a generation of young adults who have a really hard time struggling to be resilient. And so I think our conversation is going to help with that. I think especially as you talk to the hearts and the minds of men, this is going to be really groundbreaking. So thanks for being on the show.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about Grace Explorations as we dive into the conversation.
Yeah, so you talked about risk, and I've done a lot of risk things in my life, climbing mountains, skiing in the North Pole, all those things. I always looked at risk as not so much escaping life, but essentially not allowing life to escape you. And
Mm.
it is unfortunate. We live in such a world where safety is preeminent, and rightly so. We need to have those parameters. But I would just encourage listeners, young and old alike, that life is a risk. The gospel of Christ is a risk. What we're talking about today has risk implications. So, Grace Explorations really, I think, embodies some of those elements of risk, and its origin, if you will, is in your backyard. Wild at Heart Ministries. We've been allied with them since the very beginning. I came up out of a group. I had never heard of this kind of thing before, where guys were actually just doing life together. I was always very curriculum based, or you were doing something. You were studying something together, and it went on for 8 weeks, and then you're done. I was used to that whole format. There's nothing wrong with that. I don't want to diminish that. There's a place for it, but I went and joined a group. It was an allied group of Wild at Heart Ministries here in West Michigan. And I started doing life together with a group of men for 5 to 6 years, every Thursday morning, 6 o'clock in the morning. And I was dumbfounded, again, with my background as a professional minister, denominational leader. I just never heard of this. I couldn't believe the stuff that was coming out of these guys' mouths. And I couldn't believe the safety that was in that place.
Mm.
Where these were really dangerous stories that could go sideways really quick. And these guys were doing these, they're just cracking open their chest and just talking about the things that really meant the most. And I thought, wow, what a unique experience this is. They're telling a dangerous story, but it's in a incredibly safe place, or even a space, if you will. So that kind of planted the seed. Wild at Heart, John Overton's book is seminal. It was just a watershed moment in men's ministry. He's a very gifted communicator. And so I think he's one of the first guys that was able to really write a book the way a man's brain thinks.
Yes.
And so we hope to kind of piggyback on that with Grace Explorations. We use a lot of mountain metaphors, which for Midwest people is a little bit of a stretch. People in Colorado, it's not that big of a deal.
That's right.
I actually talked to a guy even earlier this week that wants to start a base camp, which is kind of our signature event in Colorado Springs. And the metaphors are not a stretch for them, but us flatlanders, that's like astronaut language. So, yeah, it kind of came out of that. I just wanted to create a movement where story was preeminent, where story was king, and which is essentially what the gospel is. It's a story, and the Bible is a story. It's a narrative driven theology. And so I wanted to create spaces where men could begin to, in smaller groups, whether they're around a bonfire or in larger groups at a brewery or in wedding barns, which has been really popular here in Michigan. I wanted to give them a space where they could hear these dangerous stories, where a man could tell his story and then have other men speak into his life during Q&A or afterwards or before, and just let story kind of be the sermon.
Mm.
That's another thing about the male brain, actually about the human brain, is I've preached thousands of sermons. I can't even remember any of them. I've heard tens of thousands of sermons. I can hardly remember one. But if you tell me a story, somehow my brain can categorize that and catalog it, and I never forget it. And so it leaves a really distinct impression. So we thought, what would it look like if we did something kind of similar to Wild at Heart, maybe mixed it up a little bit, made it our own, put our own little signature on it, and then that birthed a movement that started in a brewery, and now 7,000 guys later, it's kind of becoming ubiquitous here in Michigan.
That's amazing, and of course, there's so much more to this, but there's several key things that just really are ringing in my mind right now. The first one is that in order for a man to be able to take a risk, he really needs to be around
Yeah,
others, especially men, who are willing to create the safe place where you can actually take that take that big step and be
yeah,
vulnerable.
yeah.
Yeah, that's huge. And then John Eldridge has been on this program before and talked about resilience. So it's
Hmm.
interesting how the tie in here is so significant.
Yeah.
Tell me, Kevin, as you watch all of this happen, uh, do you want would you like to give a little insight into some of your story and what led you to the place where God broke you,
Yeah,
really,
yeah,
in order to prepare you? He
yeah,
sent you into the desert not to abandon you, but to have you be with him.
yeah,
And that this big story of the gospel, big story of scripture that you're talking about, um, is the story that we are in. And, you know, we're always telling our students, don't just focus on the story of your life, focus on the story that you are in.
yeah, yeah.
I'd love to just hear a little bit about that, and especially for the hearts of the men who may be listening to this program, thinking, "I'm just not sure that I have anything to contribute. I think I'm just too used up or broken."
Yeah, and in some ways, we've actually flipped that narrative with our base camp stories because the narrative arcs are so dramatic. We have guys that are like, I didn't swindle $30 million. I didn't this, I didn't do that, and we're like, but that's not the point. The point is every man's sword is his story, and so
Yeah,
the hilt of that sword is made for your hand, and that's how we advance the gospel. It's how we disciple people. It's how we fight the enemy. It's all Revelations 12:11. So I was basically a type of, if your listeners are into Middle Earth mythology, I'm a Tolkien fanatic. I even went to New Zealand, went to the film sites, but he created this character, which is really an archetype, and it was Aragorn. And so Aragorn is almost emblematic of like Adam. He's or a 30th generation Adam, where he's wandering all these wounded wastelands of Middle Earth, and he's an exile and he has a royal bloodline, but he doesn't know who he really is, or
mm,
he's running from it. And so he went through a long exile period. It's emblematic that his story was really his sword, because his sword was shattered every time he took it out of its sheath. In the earlier parts of that whole trilogy, it was always shattered, and it was a point of shame, which is emblematic of going back to Adam and the shame that we carry within us of the original sin. But what would it look like if we created, spaces where guys could be reminded of their original glory, instead of being policed by their original sin? And so God was very kind to me. It took a lot of severe mercy and awful grace and all these paradoxes that we don't bunch together
Yeah.
bring me into a space where almost like Corey ten Boom, who arguably left or led my great aunt to the Lord in the same prison camp because they were both imprisoned as Dutch resistance workers and hiding Jews and all that stuff. But she always said that you never know that God is enough until God is all you have.
Mm,
So I think it was, you mentioned the word desert. I think that's what the desert does. It strips you of pretense, it strips you of your mask, it strips you of your false self. All these words kind of come up and percolate to the surface. And so I went through two divorces and bankruptcy, which was concurrent with the second divorce, and just reached a space right after being involved in another film called Finding Noah that's on Amazon Prime. We were looking for Noah's Ark on top of Mount Ararat over 5 summers. I was a lead mountaineer, and we had a security detail with us every year. And in 2013, I was collecting a lot of dots, but nothing was connecting. And I remember sitting on top of the mountain. The Hollywood film crew was there. The film itself went nationwide in theaters. Gary Sinise narrated it. We didn't know if it was going to be anything because it felt really rough on the back end. But I was just talking with these guys off camera, and we had a security detail because Mount Ararat is in a very nefarious, geopolitically tense area. There's been tens of thousands of casualties there between the PKK, which is a militarized State Department recognized terrorist group that are fighting the Turks. And so there's just a lot of stuff going on there, let alone just the mountain itself. But we had a security detail like we had every year. One guy was a Navy SEAL, there was an Army Ranger there, and there was a special ops Air Force medic who I couldn't get past 14,000 feet because half of his cap was blown up.
mm.
I couldn't get him to climb. And then he pulls up his pant leg. I was like, yeah, you probably need your full calf to do this.
Wow. Wow.
So I'm listening to these guys. I had already been in some therapy, but to be honest with you, it was so effeminate. I just couldn't connect with it. I grew up in a meat processing plant. My dad was a butcher. I mean, I've just grown up with like men's world, right?
Yeah.
And so these guys were trying to probe into my wounds. And I was like, I just can't even connect with you guys. But when these special ops guys were like, dude, you got what we got. And I was like, arc fever. And they're like, no, ding dong, you have
Mm,
PTSD. And I was like, how could you, why would you even say that? It totally took me off guard. But something rang true about that. And they said, well, when we look in your eyes, you've got this 2,000-yard vacuous stare.
mm,
The lights are on, nobody's home. We know what that looks like because we struggle with that same vacuous, empty uh, stare. And then they said something, I'll never forget this, and I hope this connects with your viewers and listeners. They said, and when you speak, you're always punishing your past. There's a lot of regret, a lot of unreconciled moments, or when you speak of your future, you're fearing it. So you're punishing your past, you're fearing your future. There's a lot of anxiety. You're always waiting for the next foot to fall. We can tell your limbic nerves are just fried. We don't know what's going on in your frontal cord. Like your neurology is just all messed up.
yeah.
You're just high alert all the time. You're jacked up. And they said, here's the thing, because you're punishing your past and you're fearing your future, you're never now.
Mm.
And that's
Whoa.
into me like it was an epiphany. I mean, almost like the clouds part. And I was like, okay, now I've got a breadcrumb on the trail.
Yeah.
Now I can whiteboard this thing out. And it explains why both marriages were very lonely. It explains why, as a man who was suffering from untreated trauma, I was already divorced from myself. It explains why people who are suffering from that, who are already separated from themselves, don't even bring a whole person into the marriage. And so those marriages are very lonely because they're not even bringing their whole person into the relationship. They can't even be present. It hurts too much.
Mm,
So that was huge. And then 2013 happened, and the divorce and the second divorce and the bankruptcy were concurrent. So not only did I lose a really important relationship, but I lost money, which as a Dutchman, that's like
yeah.
salvation, right? We dream
Yeah.
about this stuff, Dutchman's Gold. And there's all these mythologies and these legends. And so I found myself getting off the mountain on Mount Ararat in 2013, and I was just in a really bad space, and my brain was on fire. And I thought, you know what? I just got to make everything super uncomplicated. So I kind of just treated the next several years, and I didn't mean it for it to happen this way. I thought it was just going to be a couple days, and a couple days turned a couple weeks, and months, then years. But for the next half a decade, I lived in a vehicle. and I showered every day at health clubs. I was still a national speaker on men's ministry circuits, which I loved because I had a hotel room and carpet in the bathroom. It was
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
fantastic. Um, so I just kind of went off grid and I went into this exile period and I was just dragging around a broken sword. And then I started to slowly, that sword, that story began to be reforged and it started coming back together again. And then I realized, wow, when I can own the story, all of it, the good, the bad, and the ugly, my part, I can't own other people's parts, but when I can really own this thing, I think what happened was I got my strength back. And when I was able to own the story, I was able to offer it, which is that's like the DNA of every honorable man is he wants to do something heroic. He wants to be in some epic story. And when you get your story back, when you get your strength back, and when you start owning your story, you're able to offer it to other people. And that's where it gets really exciting because now you can help men in my particular world and everyone reframe the story that they're living in.
That's that's incredible. There's so many insights there. I think everybody who's watching or listening to this right now, just go back and rewatch the last 5 minutes. Yeah. Those are hugely important lessons. You think about the experience of men in society today. I think about a lot of the young men I work with. They're no longer even sure what it even means to be a man.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we've got these things going on that are part of the way God designed us, running into a culture that says there is no such thing as a man. And if there is such a thing as a man, it's toxic.
Yeah.
Okay? There's no escape from that. You're bad and you're ruined.
Yeah.
And we're going to have to stay away from what God designed in you because otherwise you're going to hurt
Yeah.
people.
Yeah, there's I really like to rephrase it. There's a toxic war on masculinity. I know there's even a book title by that. Maybe you've had
Yeah, this Nancy Pearcey has just written a book on that, and I thought that was so great because the
yeah,
people always talk about the war on toxic masculinity, but it
but
is
it's
a
toxic.
toxic war on masculinity. Yeah, Nancy's
Yeah,
going to be on this show, so we are going to have her on here to talk more about that. But
yeah.
yes, yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, I think, you know what, to me, Christ is the ideal man. And I love that Jordan Peterson has really come to that same conclusion. I watched him 5, 6, 7 years ago, and he said, I'm about 3 to 4 years out on becoming a Christian. And I thought, boy, if that happens, this could be like a C.S. Lewis moment because here you have this brilliant, the guy has so much bandwidth and the way he articulates, and he really has become a prophet to the young men's generation. He's helping them to just clean up your room. I mean, everything from practical
Yeah,
to prophetic and poetic and everything in between. But he said, you know what? It all hinges on the resurrection. He was very clever to understand that the fulcrum of our faith, the access point, is the resurrection. If that didn't happen, then nothing happened. But he came to this place, and it's actually on YouTube. He had this dream, like this vision. I know I'm butchering this, but it was something to the extent where he began to understand that Christ is the master archetype. He's the template. He's the ideal man in every way, shape, and form, not as a false myth, but as a true reality. And when I think a man can understand that, it just clears up a lot of confusion because Christ was, um, he could be innocent as a dove in one moment and then as wise as a serpent in the next moment. He could be rough and warrior like, but tender. He just had this embodiment of both, in some ways, feminine and masculine energy. And I thought, boy, what a wonderful ideal man to go after. And that's the unfortunate thing about this masculine energy. When it goes dark, it always wants to hurt other people. Feminine energy, typically, when it goes dark, they hurt themselves, whether through eating disorders or life in the womb and prematurely ending that. But for men, there's just when that energy goes dark, and they always make the news and they fill our prisons,
yeah.
they're going to hurt people because if they're hurting, they're going to hurt other people. They're not going out alone. And so we're trying to get men to learn how to dance with the sword, because if you don't know how to use your story and how to reframe it in light of the greater story, the big story, the gospel story, which is really how God tells a story. I think at the end, the ultimate epiphany is, oh, wow, I think God was actually telling his story through my story. Maybe they're one story, and it is, but it takes a while to figure that out. But if you don't know how to dance with that sword and use that, it can actually harm yourself. And so we're always careful, and we have video series, we have all kinds of processes that helps a man to not only hear another man's story, but to retell a story, not just to, join a Toastmaster club and tell your story better. That's not what this is about. There's nothing performance about that. It's more pilgrimage and progress. But we're there to help a man process that, because once he can retell the story, then he's able to handle that sword with great efficiency, bring strength to his marriage, to his family, to his culture, to his workplace, and that slowly but surely will erode the toxic war in masculinity, because then you'll have real men coming out of the gate.
Yeah. There is a lot we need to process through, and we are going to have Nancy Piercy on the show, as I mentioned. We're going to be doing other shows that sort of help unpack this, because the loss of a concept of godly masculinity and godly femininity has cost our culture
Oh,
dearly.
yeah,
And so what we tend to do is just adopt the stereotypes.
yep,
So a man grows up and feels weak, so he makes himself stronger and then controls other people. Uh, but you mentioned the masculinity of Jesus, which I think this is something we've got to explore more. We got to understand this. When Jesus said, "I'm meek," he wasn't saying I'm weak.
yeah,
The term meek, and you probably teach this in your program, as I understand it, was the word that Greek people used to describe the under controlness of a war horse.
yes,
This is a war horse. But this war horse is powerful, but it's meek because it's under the control of its rider. And because it's under the control of its rider, then it can fulfill its mission.
exactly.
So meekness is not weakness.
Right. Right. Yeah. Jordan Peterson says something along the lines of, we're seeing what dangerous men can do, but he says, just wait and see what weak men will do. The
Yeah.
havoc will wreak on the world is unprecedented. It'll destroy families, it'll erode governments. And so there's a delicate balance there. I think with the group and the tribe that I'm with, and we now have films, and we can talk about that in a little bit as well. But it all comes back to, if you don't know who you are, you're always going to be defined by what you do. And so identity is just so paramount. And I find that even in Christendom, we kind of park our truck of, okay, I'm a sinner and I'm saved by grace. That's great. To me, that's like base camp. That's just a starting point. You have to admit that. You have to deconstruct the human ego. I think in some ways, our Buddhist Sherpas are leagues ahead of most Christians that I've met as far as deconstructing human ego, because that's how they experience their nirvana. So we can learn from them. I don't agree with their theology, but there's some characteristics there that make them really great humans. But if you're just parked there and you're just always a sinner, or you're always just a servant, or you're just a soldier in the army of God, or a saint that believes, or you have to kind of climb and get to that true summit, and find that space where that above all those other metaphors, which are all important, they're stepping stones. They're base camp, camp 1, 2, 3, 4. But at the summit, I think the full revelation of who we are as men is we are beloved sons of Almighty God.
Hmm.
And if that's not enough, nothing will ever be enough. And you will constantly spend the rest of your life, however long God gives you on this planet, defining yourself by what you do, because you simply don't know who you are.
Wow.
And I'm really big on that. I think if you can get a guy to fully embrace that he's a beloved son, everything changes, because now he realizes, wow, okay, so I have a father. We have a fatherless generation. I mean, every generation that's coming into American society now is less father than the one before. And in certain ethnic groups, it's exasperated to the point of almost oblivion. So we have guys that can't even conceptualize a heavenly father or a father, period. They have no framework, there's no template. And so we spent quite a bit of time in that, because I think if I can get a guy, a man, and men's ministry is more about sucking out poison. I was a youth pastor for 10 years. I love what you guys do because it's more proactive. You guys are a bit more upstream. We're kind of midstream. But when you get guys in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, actually, we mostly work with 40 to 60-year-olds. There's enough regret there, and there's enough damage that's done that you're kind of sucking out poison for a while, just trying to get rid of the lies that they've lived, the false narratives that they've lived. And typically a man, because we hate failure, and anything that feels like failure we avoid. So we avoid therapy, we avoid doing deep life with other men, We avoid being vulnerable because our number one fear is failure, and that all feels like failure. But until you can get a guy in a space where there's no other options,
Yeah.
which God merciful did to me, I had no other options. I had to go into biblical community. I had to find a counselor. I had to do life with men. We just avoid it. We're such a bunch of cowboys in America. We just want to have big acres, big house, big trucks, and just stay the heck out of my way and don't get too close. I even say that in the documentary. Don't get too close. Like Yellowstone, right? It's the whole series. Don't get on my land.
Yeah, yeah. Kevin, you used that term true summit,
Yeah,
and that is finding the true summit. I want to talk about that first as a metaphor for where you're headed,
yeah,
where you're walking along side these men and going to the true summit. But then also the way you've encapsulated this in a film, that was actually a real journey that you took
yeah,
as part
sure.
of the spiritual journey to go up to the Mount Everest base camp after you had nearly died. There's so much here, but I'll just let you lead and talk about that, what that true summit means, and then the whole process of making that film, and then why that was such a heart calling for you.
Yeah. So, to just give a little bit of backdrop and context, for many years, I was in the warrior phase of life. And every time we have a group of men gather, poetically, if I'm putting on my God goggles, I see warriors with swords, I see kings with scepters, and I see sages with staffs. And those are emblematic of the masculine journey. And so a lot of men get stuck in that warrior phase where they're always doing stuff to figure out who they are. And there's nothing wrong with that. When you're a young man in your teens and 20s and 30s, man, you're still trying to figure out who you are by doing stuff. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. That's the time when you build your family, you build a company, or you climb the corporate ladder, you get involved in leadership in your community. I mean, those are times when you're checking a lot of boxes. But if you're not, you know, exiting out of that, I wouldn't say totally exiting out of that because that warrior archetype is always there. But if you don't transition into becoming a king, which is more about governing and leading and mastering yourself and being part of a story that's bigger than you, and then ultimately being a sage where you've been there, done that, you just get kind of stuck. And so for my 20s and 30s, like most men, I was checking a lot of boxes. I was aspiring to become one of less than 100 people in the world that would complete the Explorer's Grand Slam, which is 9 point objectives. You climb the 7 continental summits, including Mount Everest, and then you ski to the North and South Pole. And since 2005, I basically have stopped at 6 of those 9. I climbed 5 of the continental summits. In the background is actually Denali.
Hmm.
We climbed it as McKinley, but it's now Denali or both.
Yeah.
And then also ski to the North Pole. But I was just, I couldn't figure out what was going on. There was a sub narrative that was driving me. It was almost like this river in a cave that was subterranean, and it was just driving me kind of like this engine under a hood that you just can't quite pop up. And I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew that there was something else driving me to do these things other than just to check a box. And what I didn't figure out until my middle age years was if you can't do the 18-inch journey from the head to the heart, which is where the deep life occurs by Ecclesiastes, and almost every world religion understands that, or anybody that's been in therapy or in that space, they understand that the heart is really the captain of the ship, if you will. There's nothing wrong with the mind. We need to love Christ and God with all of our minds as well. But there's something about sinking deeper into the heart where you start to feel things and where that deep life is. That if you can't do those 18 inches, then you're forced to do 18,000 feet or 18,000 miles, like I did with the North Pole. So I wasn't able to figure that out, that because I couldn't internalize, I externalize everything. And so now I look back on my climbing years, which quite frankly, a number of those expeditions should have killed me. A lot of the people that I climbed with and journeyed with are no longer here because they, I guess you could say they died doing what they loved, and that's certainly true. But we all had the same thing in common. We were all running from something.
Wow.
All of us had broken lives. We had trauma that was untreated, and we were trying desperately to exorcise these demons, if you will, through external means. And all that produces is just a singular, transcendent uh, yeah, it was a cathartic moment,
Mhm.
somebody reaching the North Pole, and then the buzz goes away. It's just like an adrenaline gland, and then you've got to go back and do more. And so you keep pushing the envelope, and all the while you don't realize that, man, this might just be an 18-inch journey.
Mm.
It might have nothing to do with climbing Everest or going 18,000 miles to the North Pole. Maybe I'm missing it. And so I began to realize that I think I'm misinterpreting my story. I think that because I'm feeling this pain, that I'm in a punitive situation where God is punishing me because I'm bad and I'm stupid. So I can only learn the hard way. And in reality, when the shame started being released and the stories started being told, and I started doing life with men, I began to realize, no, I think I have my metaphors mixed up. I think I'm actually a patient. And instead of a prisoner being punished, I'm actually a patient that's being healed. And the funny thing about climbing high, if you get to Camp 3 on Everest, which is 23-ish, 23,000 feet or so, you sleep the night with oxygen. The Russians figured this out like 40 years ago, probably more like 30 years ago. Now everyone emulates it, but they'll put you up at Camp 3, and very rarely do you continue on unless you're superhuman Sherpa. They bring you all the way down to the trailhead to Namche Bazaar, which is like 11, 12-ish, depending on where you're at in that particular village. And they do it for the singular reason that nothing heals in thin air.
Mm.
So if you have a paper cut, anything um, internally, you just don't have enough oxygen at 23,000 feet to heal. And so they take the people all the way down, which is really the germ of what base camp is. It's just getting guys to stop redlining, stop pushing through, stop blasting through stop signs, and just take a moment to settle yourself, enter into the story of another man, participate in the Q&A, join small groups that are spinoffs of that, all for the singular reason that nothing heals in thin air. You can't heal anything on the summit.
Wow.
It's be a transcendent moment, but you have to do life in the valley. You have to do life at base camp. And so it took me a long time to figure these things out. And then once the shame started lifting off, all these ego driven things kind of just didn't really have as much leverage. And then that was punctuated further. Um, what will now almost be 3 years ago in 2019, I'll just be really brief here. I was out on a training run for a half marathon. It was just a 10K loop, and I died. I had a full blown cardiac arrest. I wear a defibrillator now. Boston Scientific, they actually sponsored me to climb to Everest Base Camp. They're like, we can't tell you shouldn't go, but we can't tell you can't
but
go either because it's
but yeah,
sucky.
yeah. But if you do, take our equipment with you, and
Right.
we'll
I can tell you, I just signed a lot of paperwork before I
yeah,
left.
put
There's
a big headband on.
so it was a crazy experience, and it was punctuated by this out of body experience. Like I have a very visceral feel of what it means to be a trichotomy, that we're a spirit that lives in a body that has a mind, and that we're actually spiritual beings having a human experience. And that whole 15 minutes of no heartbeat and people working on me, some good Samaritans, they happen to be nurses, ER nurses that happen to drive by, that happen to notice that I was dead, that happen to do CPR. I happened to run by, a fire station who became the guys that thumped me back to life. All these things, after everything went dramatically wrong, everything has to go very, very right, or you just don't survive. They save about 3% of cardiac arrest. Well,
Wow.
LeBron James' son, just 2 weeks ago, same thing,
Yeah.
just dropped. And if they hadn't thumped him, uh, it's done. CPR is great. It keeps your vitals going, or at least brain flowing to your vitals. So if they can bring you back, you're in somewhat of a human state. But when I came out of that experience, everybody that's had these near death moments, and I had a whole out of body. I believe I met the risen Christ. It's a whole other story, and that's all talked about on YouTube and on our webpage. But I came out of that thinking, I gotta like, what's going to motivate me now? You know, it's like, what's really important.
Mm.
I knew I was brought back because the mission wasn't complete, but the engine to climb Everest, just to climb Everest and feel good about myself and have like my 30 minutes of fame, just wasn't driving the truck anymore. And that's when I began to discover that I think the true summit, metaphorically speaking, is never a place. It's actually not even a summit. It's a space.
Mm.
Just like prison. Our This film that we created is now going to be in the hands of 3 to 500,000 prisoners on a tablet starting in September,
Wow.
called the Pando app. It's a wonderful thing. And so prison is also a space. Yeah, there's buildings and there's walls and there's different look, but any place that you're not free becomes your prison. Any place that you're not aware and present is your false summit. And so the true summit became this driving metaphor of how can we capture the ethos of base camp and grace explorations and all the things that we're doing in a 30-minute film, and just juxtapose the Himalayan range, which has no peer. It's peerless. It's just gargantuan. I mean, we climbed a 18,500 foot peak called Kalapatar, which is right around base camp area, and you still look way up to
Wow.
Everest. It's just
Wow.
crazy. I mean, 18,000 feet, 500, that's taller than two other continents, three other continents. So it's just nuts to even think about that. But we wanted the viewer, as they watch the film, to feel like as we're going up, we wanted the mood, the ambiance, the narrative, the whole collective experience. We wanted the viewer to feel like they were going in. And the whole film starts out with a black screen, and it's a killer quote from John Muir, who's arguably the best guy to quote for mountains. But he said, um, "You're not in the mountains are in you."
Mm, mm,
And so we wanted to get people to think about flipping the narrative. This is not an adventure documentary like all the other ones, and there's fantastic ones out there that are crazy and they should have died and they came back and it made a great film. That's not what this film is about. What this film is really about is not dealing with the what and the where, because there's so many of those. This film deals with the why. Why are you doing what you're doing? Do you even know who you are? And maybe you've already climbed Everest within. Maybe.
mm. Yeah.
There's a lot there
Well,
to.
yeah. There's, yeah. I pause, not just because I don't have anything to say. I've always got something to say. I'm just reflecting on the power of what you've just described, and I'm wondering as I get ready to go over here in a little bit to speak to the Summit Ministry students on the last full night of their 2 week program,
Oh, wow.
how I speak to the hearts of the young men. Of course, there are young men there, young women there, but how do you how do you apply this principle of the true summit if you're with a 16, 17, 18-year old? You know, in a week from when we're recording this, they'll be off to a college or university,
Yeah.
many of them, half of the group.
Yep.
And they'll be presented with a panoply of false worldviews and false worlds and false ideas about what it means to be a man. How do you help? How do you help a young man in that space?
Yeah. I just bury yourself in the Gospels. I love the Pauline epistles and the rest of the New Testament, but that deals a lot more with dogma. And Paul was certainly a Christian mystic of the first order, as was the Apostle John. So there's a lot of stuff they say. You have to read it. It's almost like Dante. You'll never get all of it. It's just
Mm,
impossible because they're just talking on so many different levels, and it's like a diamond. But I think to keep it simple, the Gospel of John is really a great intimate portrayal of who Christ was, and kind of like the old revivalists, read the red, right? Just read the words of Christ and use him as your north star. Use him as your true north or your true summit. You just can't go wrong with that, because it's interesting in the culture at large. The people that I work with, which are about half non-church and half churched, I don't see a lot of disconnect between the issue of Christ. I think they almost believe the same thing.
yeah.
It's just the church and all that stuff that kind of, for whatever reason, makes it more complicated than what it is. But I think for a young man, and I have a son that's leaving for college here this week. I've got a daughter that leaves next year, and I'm very, very thankful to God that the same DNA that's in them, that God spark that's in me, is also in them. And I didn't give that to them. I gave my DNA, but there's some God spark. And I think for young people and for parents of young people that are going into these situations where everything is deconstructed to the point where there's nothing left, which is really the full flower of postmodernism. I think we just have to rely on the fact that there's a God seed in all of us. There's an eternal peace that's immortal, our spirit, if you will. and that God somehow will guide them into all truth. And that's ultimately all the lies that we'll ever believe are going to die. The only thing that lives is the truth. The only thing that lived when I passed on into the next dimension for that 15-minute window, which was really time outside time. The guy that actually picked me up, the paramedic, I had a chance to meet him at the awards ceremony. I was like, hey, there's like four of us. It's like, are these the guys you saved this month? And they're like, no,
Wow.
these are the people that we saved this year.
Oh,
Um, but he said something. He said, "You're straddling two dimensions." He says, "Every once in a while, we pick up people like you, and you went somewhere, and you're not there totally, and you're back, but you're not totally back." And I think if we can train young people to somehow live in that Celtic place, that thin place where you can straddle both dimensions, and where you have the God goggles on, and you've got full vision, where you see what's happening, that your battle is not against the smartest professor at your university or your
mm,
peer. Your battle is against spiritual darkness, and darkness always needs a lie to live. And if you can just look at it from that perspective and not get so offended by everything or be easily swayed, but to hold on to the truth, which is, I think, epitomized in the gospel, it keeps it um, more clear. It's a tough world out there, to be sure. I just think that we have to trust as parents and also young people going in, trust the Holy Spirit inside of you, the Spirit of Christ inside of you, that He'll guide you into all truth. And even though it may appear that you're severely outnumbered, you don't see the full picture. The prophet did, the chariots of fire in the hills and flaming angels with swords, but there is much, much more of us than there are of them.
mm.
And that'll always be the case. And so I think if they can keep their eyes on Christ, saturate their soul in the Gospels, particularly reading the red, reading the words of Christ, because perfect theology has always been and always will be Christ. He's perfect theology.
Yeah.
He's the perfect ideal man on which to live your life.
One of the guests we've had on this show, a good friend of mine, we've worked together for decades, John Stone Street from the Colson Center,
Mhm.
reminds people all of the time, no matter what happens, we live in a world in which Jesus Christ has risen from the dead.
Yeah,
That's the true world. Now,
the
Satan
same
tells us
timeline.
lies.
Yeah,
Satan doesn't come to us and say, "What I'm about to tell you is a lie, but I hope that you are tricked by it." He
yeah,
comes in and says, the world that you think exists, where God is real and Jesus is risen from the dead and you have purpose, that world doesn't actually exist.
mm,
There is no good God.
yeah,
There is no meaning or purpose to your life. And there is no hope that somehow the experiences of your life will be redeemed for some purpose that's actually bigger than you.
yeah,
And so learning to stay focused on the gospels and what Jesus said is the way to, like you said, just be reassured to know this is the world that actually exists.
hmm,
Jesus really did rise from the dead. Nothing my professor says will change that.
yeah.
Nothing my roommate says will change that. No experience that I have where I don't live up to my own potential changes that.
Yeah, when you think it through, the professor and the student that would be antagonistic or agnostic or even atheistic, if you will, if I'm using my grammar correctly here, towards God, they're not really qualified to speak in something they don't know anything about.
Right.
So if they don't have a relationship with God, or they haven't met Jesus Christ in the afterlife or in this life. Like, why does their opinion even matter? They're speaking out of ignorance. They don't realize that. They are totally living in their brain, which is great, but that's where the ego lives. And so they'll never escape that place, because that also is the control center. If you can think your way through or think your way out of something, it feeds into that control mechanism. But the heart is much more delicate. It's always the stowaway on any ship that sets sail. It always sneaks in, and it always deals with more of the emotive, not the cerebral. And so it's much more unsettling, especially for men. But I wouldn't give any. This is easy for me to say as a 55-year-old, but if a guy got up in a classroom, and started spouting off stuff, I'd be like, I don't. You're just not qualified. You don't have a relationship with this person, so you're speaking out of complete hearsay. You don't know who it is that you speak of.
Mm,
Now, if you had an encounter and a revelation, an epiphany, yeah, we could have different viewpoints, but we're going to be on the same page eventually, because you're going to have an Apostle Paul type experience,
yeah.
uh, and the scales on your eyes are going to be taken off of. So it's hard out there, and um, it's a crazy world, but I have got to believe along with many others, that this generation is just like, um, Ruth or an Esther, especially Esther, that they were created for such a time as
Mm,
this. And the light and darkness is so profound. I have to believe for both of my kids, 17 and 19 years old, that God has allowed them to be placed into the human timeline at this exact moment for this exact time. They have a unique set of skills that are for their generation. David didn't serve all generations, he served his generation and then he went to sleep. And I think for young people, if they can realize that, you know what, all these giants, they're just foreshadows of a miracle. It's almost like you have to have these peaks, these unsurmountable odds to focus and to give you some type of greatness that you can feel, because greatness always comes out of adversity.
mm. Man, you have dropped a lot of wisdom on us during the time we've had together. And a lot of times authors come on this show, and I've got my stack of books that they send me to read before we go on the show. Then I have all of the people who, quite frankly, I've only skimmed the book because I didn't have time to read the
Yeah.
entire thing before they came on the program. But our homework for this, which I can't wait to do, is we've got to take 30 minutes and we've got to watch this film.
Yeah, if you have
So,
a time to even plug it in at your school, you can go to our website and just get the free leader screening, or there's a package you can download that actually is a high res, and then there's a bunch of other material that comes with that. But Um, to just be clear, I know they were introducing me as a filmmaker. I'm the producer, so
yeah,
I all I did was answer questions on a camera and then raise the money for it. And now my job is to make sure it gets out on every platform on planet Earth. So I do really well in that space. But the filmmaker was Corbin Robbie, who actually has been my brand strategist from the very beginning. We started Basecamp together, and he really was able to capture my voice just like any good speechwriter does. He knows me so well that he actually can say what I want to say better than I can say it,
yeah,
and he did a phenomenal job. And I think viewers will be able to say, you know what, we've done really well in many secular film festivals, and have even been reviewed by film students. And I was so blessed to hear them speak because they get it. Even though it is a faith film towards the end, we talk about brotherhood and belonging to Christ and our identity as a son of God, a beloved son of God. We don't, the first whole, 28 minutes is basically being able to qualify ourselves as having the ability to speak into someone's life, because we're not coming in as experts. We're coming in as broken, humble people, meek but strong, right?
yeah,
Controlled strength, and being able to deliver a story that's compelling in such a way that the cinematography is gorgeous, drone footage of Everest. I mean, it's a really compelling narrative, but we hope that people will walk away saying, you know what? I think I am not living the true narrative. I am not climbing towards a true summit. Whatever I'm climbing right now is not the true summit.
yeah.
We hope people see that.
Kevin, the website, give us that one more
Yeah.
time.
Yep, Grace Explorations, that's plural with an S.com, and there's options on the homepage to view it free. You can just enter your email, and then that'll give you a promotional watermarked version, or you can download, and that gives you the high res. And then for leaders that are listening, or perhaps people that work with young people or anybody in any leadership capacity, the companion guide and the whole package of video series on how to retell your story. There's more adventure stories. Helpful articles. It all is bundled together in this big, massive package for 99 bucks, and they can get the whole thing. And it's basically a turnkey deal. You can
Yeah,
show it, and all the questions are built in, so you can kind of hit the snooze button and let your students have at it.
yeah, yeah. Well, young men, middle-aged men, older men, all need to see this, and and then stay focused on what it is that's at the heart of this. As you said right from the outset, that you're a beloved
Yeah,
son of God,
yeah,
that you are identifiably His, that you're in His image, and getting at into your heart and not just into your mind, and letting that shape the opportunities you have, as you mentioned, for a time such as this.
it was Jesus's only credential. He had nothing else to brag about. The only thing that credentialed and qualified him to lead those 3 years, live those 3 years that he lived as he came out of obscurity, was, "This is my son, my beloved son, in whom I'm well pleased." And when that revelation sank into the humanity, Jesus was the human, Christ was the divine, and so they came together. It wasn't a first or last name
Yeah.
situation. But when that divinity and humanity mixed in that singular transcendent moment, I think as a human, the human Jesus understood that, wow, that's all I need. And then we know the next chapter, his ministry began, but
Yeah.
first the desert, right? And so you have to have that identity. I just can't emphasize that enough. I think identity is the critic. I know we go after all these other rabbit trails, and identity is a word that's put in front of everything now. Identity politics and everything is, but if we can help people understand who they are in Christ and in God's family, it really unclutters so many other issues.
Yeah.
It's a clarifying one.
Kevin, thanks so much for being on
Thank
the
you.
show today. This is so powerful. I'm grateful.
I appreciate you having me on. Next time, let's go on a run together or climb some.
Okay. Thank you to my guest today, Kevin DeVries, for coming on the show. You can find out more about Kevin, about the True Summit documentary, 30 minutes long, at graceexplorations.com. The Dr. Jeff Show podcast is a resource of Summit Ministries, and Summit equips and supports the rising generation to embrace God's truth and to champion a biblical worldview. If we can help you live out a biblical worldview as a student or reach the next generation as an educator, church leader, parent, please go to summit.org/resources. You won't believe how many articles, videos, ebooks, and more are available there at no charge. We want to help you be the kind of leader that we really need so desperately in our nation for such a time as this. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you enjoy the show, would you consider leaving a review on your favorite platform? Reviews help more people find the show. And if you want more resources that can help you live out a biblical worldview as a student, parent, educator, or church leader, head over to summit.org/resources for articles, videos, ebooks, and more. Also, if you're looking for more great podcasts that will build your faith and inspire you, our friends at Edify have just what you need. You can find more podcasts, including the Dr. Jeff Show podcast, on the Edify app. You download it at edify.app, or you can search for Edify, which is spelled Edifi, in the Apple and Google Play stores.